Once I beat this fight, I go to the level exit, and the game crashes. This is the end of part 1, by the way. This is the furthest I've ever gotten into Collapse. There's so much ambition in this game. It's so charming and rough and awkward and obtuse. There's gold in these hills, and it's killing me that I can't progress any further. The truth is, I'm really doing this video just to get all of the things I want to say about this game out there.
Well, looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. Last year, I did a passing thoughts on Ukrainian action game Collapse, and lamented at the fact that I couldn't progress past the second chapter because the game would crash at a specific loading point. I figured that I was done with the game and ready to move on to greener pastures. But I couldn't. That game sat on my mind and wouldn't budge. Like I said in my previous video, there's gold in them hills. The problem with Collapse, and a lot of other Eastern European games, is that their documentation is practically non-existent for English speakers. It's a shame because there are a ton of titles on my abandonware that look promising, but I'll never know because I can't read Cyrillic. But it's all good now, because I solved the problem. I tried a variety of methods to get this thing going. The usual stuff: compatibility mode, limiting cores. I even dusted off the old family comp and hooked it up to my rig with a capture card to see if I could get it running on an older Windows machine. But all I got out of it were stalled frames and a reminder of why Windows Vista is the worst OS. So here are my findings. Although the only viable way to get Collapse in English is through Steam, it doesn't actually use Steam DRM. So you could take the game files from your Steam folder, and you have the entire game. By browsing through some files, I found that the game outputs a crash log. Looking through the log, I picked up the phrase "out of virtual memory." Turns out that Collapse is a VRAM hog, and that's the cause of the crashing. Whenever you load or reload a checkpoint, the game is eating up the VRAM until there isn't enough and it crashes. The solution was to increase the VRAM storage on the hard drive where I installed the game. That's it. Now we can talk about the game itself. I'll give a basic rundown of Collapse up until where I left off in my previous video, but I won't go into the same level of detail for every segment, as the game has a lot going on. Collapse is a 2008 action game by Ukrainian developer Creo Team and publisher Bout Entertainment. You play as Rodan, the last of the lords, an upper caste of a society living in the blighted wasteland known as the Dump. A bomb went off and obliterated all of the lords, leaving a power vacuum in the society. After a meeting with the surviving faction leaders regarding who should take over now that the former ruling caste had been wiped out, Rodan ventures off towards the center of the dump to a yawning chasm known as the Hole to fulfill a prophecy of sealing the hole with the help of 7 keys. He fights man and monster alike, meets friends, falls in love, loses his friends in love,
Как жаль.
and learns something about himself. That's Collapse. The plot's okay, but I was more compelled with the game's other aspects. The first thing I've got to point out is that the level design and environment art are fantastic, but you wouldn't know that for most of the early game. The game is broken up into several chapters, and each chapter features a linear level, but those levels are packed with winding pathways and secret areas. Sometimes a level will be cheeky and tease you that a secret area exists, and you gotta go the long way around to get it. Once you get out of the prologue and the underground lab, the level design starts featuring wide open areas. After going through a gauntlet in what looks like the ruins of an industrial district, the tight alleyways open up into a large avenue with a tank situated at the end. One shot from that tank is a guaranteed game over. The side areas offer safe spots that provide the necessary firepower to take out the tank, but they're protected by monsters. The game likes to mix up which type of enemies you'll face in a given combat segment, and it does a good job being consistent with its enemy placement. You'll fight human enemies in the open air environments, and face off against monsters in the claustrophobic underground segments. Anyways, once you finally make this safe zone safe, you get a rocket launcher that you can use against a tank. It takes 3 hits to neutralize, but the best part about this set piece is that the game gives you way more than 3 rockets. So you can take this bad boy all the way down to the front of this building at the end of the road and unload the rest of the ammo against the would-be snipers hiding in the second story. After this open set piece, the level naturally weaves in and out of tighter spaces, as well as underground and above ground areas. The chapter ends with Rodan meeting up with his buddy Holman, and the two set off to go after the guy responsible for all the recent bombings, Mark.
I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
The area leading up to Mark's base is a network of pontoon bridges and scuttled ships. It's entirely open air, and the cool thing about this chapter is that the scenery is constantly changing. You're not just staring at another grimy wall as you get funneled into the street. The natural beauty of the dusky sky contrasts both the weathered ruins of the city and the cold paramilitary feel of the pontoon bridges that have been constructed to make the ruins more navigable. It feels like I'm playing a mix of Root Canal from Half-Life 2 and Lost Coast. When you finally reach Mark's castle, the environment art takes a drastic shift and takes on a more industrial, militaristic vibe. Immediately after that chapter, you get to walk along a yawning chasm in the middle of a ruined city. There's a rope bridge that connects to the opposite end, which is a simple but effective method of environmental storytelling to show that, even though the old society has ended, life still goes on and people still need to get to places. The following area is probably one of the biggest highlights of the environment art, and is probably drawn directly from the developer's experiences. It's the courtyard of an Eastern European church that's been mostly untouched. You can see religious murals decorating the walls of what appears to be the church, and the archway leading to the courtyard's entrance. This part of the chapter really only serves to be the backdrop for a puzzle, but it's nice to see these kinds of familiar environments juxtaposed against the ruins of the old world and the foundations of the new world built on top of them. Later on, the game really goes out there with the environment art, but I'll get to those parts later. Even though I'm talking up the game's environments, I need you to understand that these are like 2 distinct areas that stand out from the various apartment complexes, alleyways, highways, sewer levels, underground tunnels, and science bases. These 2 areas stand out to me because they contrast with all of the other stuff I saw for 80% of the game. There's one more open air arena near the end of the game, but it's not nearly as impressive as the ones I brought up earlier. Still, there's this really cool element in the center of the arena where these spinning discs orbit a statue that will eventually stop once you activate all of the generators. I said in my previous video that Collapse's combat doesn't feel good, and I haven't changed my opinion on that. But I also said that I found the ultimate technique in the game, which is to get to the nearest melee human enemy, press the action button to initiate a CQC maneuver, and then press action again to finish them off with a killing blow. After playing through Collapse, I learned 3 more things about this technique. 1. You have to be careful when you CQC enemies, because if you try to do the follow-up attack too soon, you could instead reset the CQC animation. You need to wait a beat to do the follow-up, but don't do it too late or you'll miss the window for the follow-up. 2. You need to do the CQC throw in a relatively open space. If you're doing it in a tight spot, you may not be able to do the follow-up and will instead reset the CQC animation. In these situations, you could opt to using sword strikes or your guns to finish off the enemy as they're getting up, but they may be able to withstand the attack. 3. You can CQC any humanoid enemy that's near Rodin's heightened build. That includes humans using guns instead of swords, and yes, even monsters. While it isn't hard to approach melee enemies, the problem with gun-toting ones is that they can pick you off with their hit-scan weapons. However, if you roll towards them by pressing crouch as you move forward, you minimize the chance of taking damage. You can't just spam crouch when you do this though, because there's a delay in the startup frames of the animation. What you have to do is wait a beat, and press the crouch button to maintain ball form, and roll your way towards your victims. The enemies can handle Dark Souls PvP strats, but there is a chance that they do a quick melee attack to push you away, so press action as soon as you're within sword swinging distance. This was my fighting style for most of the game. As you progress in the campaign, melee combat unlocks new combos that I never used. The combos use a weird mix of the pause combo system found in the Devil May Cry games, but also directional base combos found in Devil May Cry 2. I didn't bother to learn these combos, as I had already mastered the art of Sonic Fu, but this will become my downfall, as you'll see later on. When I wasn't judo throwing every enemy I could get my grubby paws on, I had to fight bosses and mini-bosses. The mini-bosses were usually these giant worms that take over the surrounding area. As far as I can tell, you can't rush past these worms because their tendrils will spring from the ground and throw you back into the arena. Defeating them is a two-step process, where you break their shields, do a QTE, whittle down their health, and then do a finishing QTE. Almost every boss encounter will feature some type of QTE. I don't mind them, but I do mind their presentation. The color for the text is bright red, and that ends up blending in with the scenery more than it should. It looks fine in this duel with Mark, but when the camera is jump cutting at a rapid fire pace while a QTE prompt is frequently changing, there's too many moving images to pick out the prompts. The real problem is that the arrow indicators are way too small to identify in a few seconds, which is how long the prompts last on screen during normal. If the indicators were either a little larger or closer to the center of the screen, it could be easier to identify them and react. Some QTE prompts were really obtuse for no reason. The prompt for this fight was so different from the other ones that required pressing movement keys. This one required me to mash the attack button, which was left mouse button on PC, but this was the only time that the prompt appeared in-game, so I had no idea what the game was asking me to do. Also, this boss fight sucks in general because this is the only way to get real damage on the boss, since he dodges most attacks. Killing bosses unlocks new abilities for Rodan to use during combat or to solve puzzles. At the beginning of the game, Rodan gets an ability called Vacuum, which is described in-game as a gravitational attack, but is actually more of an electric shockwave attack, as it's used to provide power to generators later in the game. The cool thing about gaining the abilities is that the bosses will actually be using those abilities in their respective fights. Mark has Shadow, which allows him to create copies of himself to attack Rodan. Mike Steklasa has a move called Fracture, which is just Force Lightning. This guy, who's really twitchy in his fight, actually has Zawardo, which isn't that useful when you get it, because Rodan moves about as slowly as everything else around him, despite Timestop's description saying otherwise. Also, its cooldown is way too long to be feasible in combat. Speaking of JoJo, I gotta point out that when you're storming Mark's castle, Holman accompanies you. I thought this was gonna be a really bad escort mission when I saw his health meter appear on screen, but he turns out to be a great help. He uses those clacker balls that Joseph Joestar uses in Part 2 as his weapon, and he can deal a good amount of damage to the enemies. When you're exploring the church, this bombshell, who turns out to be wearing a scientist uniform, accompanies Rodan. And a cute attention to detail in this segment is that you can see her Travis touchdown bike parked near the courtyard entrance. I didn't go too in-depth with Collapse's plot because I'm not sure if I got the full picture myself. The subtitles are microscopic, and I'm sorry to say that I won't take the time to resize them for this video like I did in Passing Thoughts, as there's just too many lines per scene to cover them all. If you want to know more about the game's setting, you can call up your contacts and ask them to provide info on given topics, which give you these kinds of interactions.
Что на этот раз?
Что ты знаешь о Железном Лорде?
Когда был объявлен карантин, на свалке вовсю велись боевые действия. Части армии Южного и Восточного фронтов попытались прорваться через укрепительный периметр, но встретили жесточайшее сопротивление и отступили.
Yeah, I don't need to tell you where Collapse cribbed this from. Don't worry if you can't understand Ukrainian, the game provides an English transcript at the end of each call to summarize the conversation. I'm spitballing here, but I don't think the devs either had the know-how or the time to add English subs to in-game sequences. The subtitles are present in the pre-rendered cutscenes, but I noticed that NPC allies will say stuff in-game that just doesn't get translated.
Что мы ищем в этом странном месте?
Карту саркофага. Нам нужно деактивировать их примерное расположение на карте. Мне нужно будет время, чтобы взломать систему безопасности и открыть доступ к центральному камерам.
Okay, so here comes the part where I bring up my grievances against this game. While I loved how the early and mid-game provided Rodan with a good amount of heavy ordnance, those rocket launchers and Gatling guns are sorely missed in the endgame levels. In fact, it was getting hard to find ammo for my guns in those final chapters. I talked up the game's environment art before, and these areas where you're just walking into the void are fantastic, but these platforming segments were one of the worst aspects of the game. I said in my previous video that you can tell whether a game was made with either keyboard or controller in mind, and this game was clearly built around keyboard controls first, because the movement does not lend well to platforming on narrow surfaces. There was one spot that I kept slipping off, and I couldn't tell why. There's no other way to describe this part of the game as anything other than worse zen. The final level is just a straight up gauntlet of monsters that also felt like it should have had a few of its segments shaved off because it started feeling monotonous. There are 4 crystals at the center of the tower that require Rodan to use each of his abilities to activate. When you activate all 4 crystals, you're taken to the final boss of the game at the top of the tower. This fight almost broke me. By this point in the game, I had no ammo in my guns and no medkits. The arena provides only one weapon, and it's a unique weapon, but all the ammo in the gun is all you get in the fight. You can recharge your ammo pool by standing in the red zone, but it's really slow. The final boss has several attack patterns, and it can easily destroy Rodin with just a few of them. The worst attack is his quick drop maneuver, because you have to crane your neck all the way up to see what the boss is going to do, and before you can react, he's already right next to you on the floor and a third of your health is gone. It took me forever, but I learned the optimal strat to wear it down with the limited ammo available. Bait it into doing the drop attack, jump forward or left to avoid damage, and then throw out a force lightning and spray it with rifle fire at point blank range, but don't try to outright kill the boss. The thing is, you can't damage race this boss. Its health will regenerate after a certain threshold, and then it goes into its recovery cycle. The boss flies around the arena and finally rests on a crystal to regain health. You have to destroy the terminal in front of the crystal to prevent the boss from making a full recovery. So how do you destroy those terminals? Well, remember those sword combos I said I never learned? Yep, time to learn them. Here's a problem with the sword combos. 1. Although it's nice of the game to show an indicator to initiate the pause combo, the timing never feels right. I always have to count my inputs in my head to make sure that I properly initiated the combo. 2. Tying the combo to different directional inputs while placing the terminals at the edges of the arena is a bad pairing. There's a good chance that you can walk off the edge while trying to initiate a combo. I had to switch off to a quiet area in the game to practice the combos and get the feel of them so that I could consistently pull them off during the final boss fight. I'll admit, I dialed the game down to easy first just to see how the game ends, but then came back and did it again on normal. This fight just isn't very good and is up there with the fight I had talked about in my Passing Thoughts video. The game ends with Rodin seemingly sacrificing himself to close the hole and save the dump, but there's a follow-up game that never made it to the West, so we'll never know if Rodin really did survive. That's Collapse. It was a pain in the ass to get up and running, and the latter part of the game is a meat grinder, but I enjoyed it overall. It had a healthy amount of set pieces and didn't feel like it was dragging on for the most part. A lot of this helps with the fact that I cheesed practically every fight I encountered. I might not be so forgiving of the game if I had approached it the way it wanted me to. Is Collapse worth playing? Yes, but only for a very specific kind of person. Do you like Eurojank? This game's full of it. Can you put up with the persistent crashes? I know I said that I solved the problem, but all I really did was place a big enough bandage over the wound when I increased my VRAM storage. Do you like the 7th gen shooter aesthetic? If so, then this game's art style may grab your attention. If you answer yes to all of these, then yeah, play Collapse. It's a diamond deeply entrenched in the rough. Take the time to learn the sword combos when they unlock, but don't be afraid to cheese the game like I did. The enemies are all way too spongy to damage to engage them as intended, and they practically swarm you in most fights. Also, it's cool to play this game on easy, especially for that final boss. Enjoy the ride, suplex the mutants, and try not to tear your hair out when you have to do this mess.